Hey guys, it's time for another pool plan video, and in this particular video I'll be covering the events and banners where Cor and Edgar will be the primary featured character. You can also refer to the cropped infographic on the left hand side of the slide to see which events these are, and this is also derived from the global forecast from the thewereotter. And as always, I'll be including the link to the full global forecast in the video description. One quick look on how I did in the last few events where Paine and Balthier were the primary featured character. I actually saved quite a lot of resources because I opted to skip for Paine, and I wanted to pull for Twins FR and hopefully get lucky for Balthier. The lucky thing is I did manage to get Twins FR on the free pool, but I didn't get any of Balthier's gear, and I don't have his FR, and of course I don't have his BT. And I tried to throw in one multi-pool so that I round off my G tokens at 100 G tokens, but that one multi-pool didn't get me anything of Balthier as well, so I decided to just cut my losses there, use high power stones to max out the free Twins FR I got, and skip Balthier completely, making my loss, or so-called investment, a total of 5,000 gems across the last few events. So moving to Cor's Lost Chapters, where we finally have a rerun of Cor, and this time Cor will be getting a newly released burst weapon for himself, alongside the rerun of his FR. On this event, there's also a second banner featuring the return of Noctis, and on this event, while Noctis will be getting a rerun of his BT, he will be getting a new FR weapon. So all in all, in this event, the new weapons are a new BT weapon for Cor and a new force weapon for Noctis. Both characters will be getting a rework as well. So starting off with Cor. In terms of damage, Cor's EX and LD, as well as the Reaper skill, which is his modified HP attack, gets updated with more brief dumps. His force attack damage is also bumped up a little bit. On top of all these damage adjustments, his EX now also gives Cor a free skill use as well. As mentioned, Cor gets a new BT weapon. When used, Cor will get an 8-turn BT aura that provides the entire player party with attack plus 50%, HP damage plus 20%, brave damage plus 50%, and HP damage cap up plus 30%. In addition, as long as Cor BT aura is up, Cor's signature Oath of Absolute Defense buff that he can grant on his ally will no longer be removed if he targets a new ally with this. There's a few implications with this. The first and most obvious one, of course, is that with his BT aura up, Cor can now buff his other two party mates with Oath of Absolute Defense, not only massively increasing the overall party's defense, but also of course now allowing Cor to trigger his preemptive strike regardless of which party player character the enemy is targeting. However, Cor's application of the Oath of Absolute Defense buff is still single target at a time. What this means is that with Cor's BT aura, you will need to target another character after getting his BT aura up to get both the other characters having this buff. So your typical rotation could be something like starting off the battle buffing one ally with the Oath, using his EX to get his EX buff up, and then the next turn going into BT plus before buffing the other character, which essentially means that Cor needs a total of 4 turns to be fully set up. Something that I wish that they gave him but he did not receive is that his preemptive strikes still remain the same. As far as I can tell anyway, they don't get any adjustment to damage with this event. Doesn't mean that Cor is bad. Cor is still one of the best often damage dealers, and with this event, not only of course he has his force weapon and force attack, he also will now have access to force echoes as well, which is very welcome in often strategies, and having the new BT aura really helps to supplement and boost the party's overall damage potential. I list Cor's force conditionals at the bottom right hand of this slide, but I won't go through them because this is nothing new. It's just a rerun of his current force conditionals. Moving on to Noctis, and Noctis also receives a pretty massive rework because it's been quite a long time since he was actually featured. First off, Noctis receives a damage rework across his entire kit, so his S1, S2, EX and LD all receives a damage rework. Notably also, if you're familiar with Noctis, he usually triggers a follow-up attack as long as the enemies are debuffed with his Warp Strike, and his follow-up attack now deals 4 HP dumps, which significantly boosts his on-turn damage. This is a pretty welcome damage rework because if memory serves me right, Noctis' LD before this event is only a single HP dump. Along with this event as well, Noctis gets a rerun of his BT, but his BT also receives a rework. First of all, his BT now also comes with an additional HP damage cap plus 30%, which is really nice. But very importantly, his BT follow-up attack, which is a different follow-up attack from the one I mentioned earlier, now has 4 HP dumps as opposed to 2 before. This essentially means that on Noctis' turn, after he does any of his skills, he will get his 4 HP dump follow-up attack, assuming he's attacking a debuff target, and then his BT follow-up attack will trigger for another 4 HP dumps on top of that. His BT follow-up attack is also triggered anytime any other player character takes an action, in a way very similar to characters such as Young or Cisne. So having a follow-up attack that has 4 HP dumps is pretty sizable in terms of off-turn damage. Of course, Noctis' so-called signature is the Warp Step buff that he can grant to your entire party. The Warp Step buff is normally a 2-turn buff that he grants the entire party on use of his LD, and it allows the entire party to take turns without increasing the turn count, and to also self-manipulate your turns to move before the enemy gets their next turn. The great thing about this event is that Noctis' newly released Force Attack also grants the entire party with 2-turn Warp Step, which means that overall he now has 2 more skill users that can grant this buff. Noctis' Force conditionals are pretty decent actually. The first conditional just requires you having some sort of stacking buff or overhead when you end your turn, and there are actually quite a lot of characters who now have some sort of stacking buff or overhead. And even if you don't have it, you can also of course use something like a Redia LD call to buff your entire party with a stacking buff. The second conditional just requires you to end your turn while having an ally that will act next after your turn ends. And this normally shouldn't be a problem as long as you're playing around with his Warp Step buff. The key thing to note about both the conditionals is that you really only need to end your turn. You do not need to actually attack an enemy to trigger this. So overall, I would say that Noctis' Force Attack is a good target to be used as a main force. My plans on this event is to pull hard on Cor's banner. The good thing for me is that I already have Noctis' BT green and his high armor is blue, so I don't need to pull on the second banner at all. I'm going hard on the first banner with tickets because I have quite a lot of tickets expiring soon, and my hope is that I of course score Noctis' FR. I really want his FR, but of course I hope to score Cor's BT weapon along the way. The question that I have though is, if I don't get Cor's BT weapon, do I want to token for it? I'm not even sure whether I have enough BT tokens, but I'm leaning towards a yes. Moving on to Edgar's event, which is going to be on the infamous Spiritus World of Illusion Shiva. In the JP version of the game, this was notorious for being a particularly challenging stage. I haven't really looked into the mechanics of it yet, so this is just going off what I hear from others, but apparently you need all 3 weapon type imperils, which is melee imperil, range imperil, as well as magic imperil. And you also need some sort of attack that ignores enemies' defense to complete the stage. There are a few characters that have weapon type imperils. For example, Oren can land melee imperil, Irvine or Friend can land range imperil, and Hope or Terra can land magic imperil. But Edgar is the only character that can land all 3 weapon type imperils in one. Anyway, coming to Edgar on this event, his S1 and S2 receives a much needed damage rework, and they now also come with 1 additional skill use each. His EX comes with a damage rework, he grants himself with all the generic buffs at quest start now, and his EX buff now grants himself more stat boosts. His LD is now instant and free turn, and when used will give him 1 additional use of Bio Blaster or Bio Blaster Plus. And that attack also comes with a damage rework. On this event, Edgar receives a newly released burst weapon, and his burst attack ignores the enemy's defense, and it lands a 1-turn trap debuff where it will reduce the enemy's brave and HP damage done by 100%, very similar to Raijin's debuff, except that of course Raijin's debuff also prevents the enemies from applying debuffs on you. But Edgar's 1-turn debuff here will also have a defense minus 20% stat, and if the enemy takes a turn while this debuff is up, it will trigger as a trap and will deal massive damage with 6 HP dumps. If this trap happens to already be up, so for example if you use his BT plus and he applies the trap and then you enter BT mode with Edgar, his BT finisher will increase the trap duration to 2 turns. So in other words, using his BT finisher will either apply this 1-turn trap, or if it's already up, extend the duration by 1 turn. Edgar's BT also comes with an 8-turn Friday White aura, where you get brave damage and brave damage cap up plus 50% each, HP damage plus 20%, and HP damage cap up plus 30%, which seems actually pretty standard for a lot of BT auras nowadays, but of course it's always very nice to have. Edgar's force attack is pretty special because it does all 3 weapon type damage. It does melee, it does range, and it does magical, and it also ignores the enemy's defense. This is actually a plus point because in many Shinryu stages, a lot of the force weaknesses usually requires a specific weapon type attack, and Edgar will fulfill all 3. He has 2 force conditionals. The first is if you do some sort of weapon type attack weakness, which is melee weakness, range weakness, or magical weakness. And a quick note here, do not confuse this with elemental weakness. Elemental weakness will not take up this conditional. It has to be specifically one of the 3 weapon type weaknesses, which means that you do need to land one of the 3 weapon type imperils to tick up the first conditional, but otherwise you get plus 40% for it. The second conditional only requires you to attack a debuff enemy, and it's 5% force gauge bonus per debuff. So assuming if the enemy has the maximum of 8 debuffs, this can potentially give you plus 40%. All in all, Edgar actually does pretty decent damage. But of course, in the current meta, there's also a lot of characters who can deal pretty decent damage. Edgar's niche is the ability to land any of the 3 weapon type imperils. But I have to say, really, this World of Illusions Shiva is really only one of the few, very few, maybe only the only stage that actually truly requires a weapon type imperil. In majority of other stages, you can probably get by with elemental imperil, which is far more commonly accessible and will get the job done as well. Nowadays, we also have characters that can provide the party or themselves with Rainbow Brave damage, and if you have the ability to do that, then you don't really need weapon type imperils anyway. That being said, as I alluded to earlier on this slide, the Spiritus World of Illusion Shiva has been talked about being a particularly difficult stage, and keep in mind that this stage is also going to be the final Dare to Defy stage. So for myself, I'm not even sure whether I'll be able to do this stage without Edgar. I think it is possible, and yes, it is possible to do this stage without Edgar. In JP there are players who've done it, but it does require very specific setup to land the specific weapon type in perils using call abilities. If you want an easy way out of this stage, obviously then Edgar is a prime choice to pull for. He can also of course come in very nicely on other stages as well, not to say that he'll be terrible in other stages, but really, and this is just my opinion, but in my mind, if you don't need weapon type in perils, then is there really a need to bring Edgar in a main party of 3? And my thought is really no. Now on this event, there's a secondary banner featuring Lunafreya, and all of Lunafreya's weapons here are a rerun. Keep in mind that Lunafreya herself will not be getting a rework and will not be getting access to her force boards as well. However, having said that, I do highly recommend to at least try to get Lunafreya's LD, because her LD call ability is one of the best utility calls in the game. If I had to pick the best utility call, I would actually vote for her, but of course that's more a personal choice. Regardless, she's the only call ability in the game that will allow you to provide your party members with multiple free consecutive turns. And yes, of course, you can always do something like main party Paine, for example, and she can do the same thing, but we are talking about call abilities here. There is no other call ability that can provide your party with multiple free consecutive turns. Lunafreya is the only one, and if you've watched any of my runs, you'll see that a vast majority of them actually use the Lunafreya LD call to help set up at the start of the fight. My plans here is, I'm not really sure actually. I think what will most likely happen is I'll just try to do the Spiritus World of Illusion stage and the Dare to Defy first without Edgar. If I can manage to scrape by without, then I'm very likely to just skip this banner altogether. But if I'm having a lot of difficulty, then I don't really mind going for Edgar himself. Alright, on this part of the video, I'll be talking about characters that I think are good value or sort of role fulfillment. The way I categorize these usually is, if the character I feel will provide great value regardless of who you already have in your roster, generally I'll put them in good value category. However, if a character will provide value but it depends a lot on who you already have built, because there may be other characters who can fulfill the similar roles, then generally I'll place these characters in the role fulfillment category. This time I actually rate both Cor and Noctis as good value, but you may notice that I didn't really mention that they are really meta or anything. They are actually very good, however there are just small flaws here and there that at the very least I think one should consider before investing heavily in these two characters. With Cor, like I said earlier in the video, the biggest drawback and something that I wish that they implement differently is the fact that he still has to apply his Oath of Absolute Defense buff one player party character at a time. And this really isn't really that big a deal in many cases. However, this means that he takes particularly longer to set up at the start of the fight, and you do need 4 different actions with Cor to complete his setup. It does help that he actually starts with 2 consecutive turns at the start, so you already have 2 of the 4. But you can imagine if you don't use something like a Paine in your main party or a Lunafreya LD call, it's going to be extremely difficult to set up with Cor. You can of course have Cor do something like use his S2 at the start to apply his Oath buff on one character, then using the Lunafreya LD call, and then going EX, going BT+, and then going S2 and applying the Oath buff on the other player party character, and this potentially allows him to complete setup immediately at the start. However, the drawback is that he needs to then equip the Lunafreya LD call himself. Nothing really major, which is why he's still in the good value category, but this is something that should definitely be considered when you're putting your party together. As for Noctis I actually really like, and back in the day I used him quite a ton in doing low turn runs, and the fact that his damage output now is significantly higher and his FR also applies swap step is something that I really look forward to. The thing though with Noctis is that he is a fairly complicated player character to play, and a fair bit of practice is required to master his swap step. The turn manipulation sounds very easy on paper, but the fact of the matter is that the turn manipulation happens only at the end of the attack after every effects have been accounted for. For example, if there are two bosses, enemies A and B, and boss A's turn will come up next. If you attack the enemy and you target boss A, normally you would warp step and move your turn before boss A, which is ideal. But if your attack happens to break boss A, the break will happen before the turn manipulation, and what this means is boss A will then move back and you will then sandwich your character's turn between boss B and boss A. This sounds fairly complicated since I'm just verbalizing this, I have to admit, but the point is that you need to pay very close attention to the turn order bar, consider the effects of your attack before attacking with the warp step buff on. That being said, if you're willing to invest time in mastering the use of warp step, I think Noctis is a fantastic character. Not only does he deal fantastic damage, and he can also of course supplement other player characters with his BT often damage as well, but the fact that he can also use warp step helps you to do no boss turn runs and also helps you to complete setup before the bosses start to act. Finally, in this category I put Lunafreya as well, but take note here I'm referring mainly to her LD call ability. I do strongly recommend to pull for her LD just to get access to the call. Whether or not to actually pull for the rest of Lunafreya's gear is going to be more a personal choice. Her damage is pretty outdated, and the fact that she doesn't have access to force bots hurt her considerably because she cannot do force echoes still. However, in the main party she does have a lot of value still because she can very easily set up quick hit prayers and heavy prayers. Now that in itself requires a lot of thinking and practice to fully optimize and make full use of. However, I still use her up till today. In fact, I did use her in one of the Dare to Defy runs with Anacro and Penelo as well, and I use her in most of the 6 warrior quests to date, just on the virtue of how powerful her quick prayer utility is. If you do want to invest in her, you do also have to consider on whether or not you want to fully green Lunafreya. Her BT aura does have some value as well because her BT aura extends the prayers that she can grant by 1 turn, which means that from a 2 turn quick prayer she can potentially grant 3 turns quick prayer instead, and that 1 turn can be potentially huge depending on your strategy and your party setup. Finally, coming to the role fulfillment category, I have Edgar here. Edgar's utility is actually pretty cool because the ability to land any of the weapon in peril sounds nice, but really there's not going to be many stages that actually require this. In more than 95% of the stages in the game, I guess, or virtually almost every stage, you can get by without weapon type in peril. Of course, Shiva, World of Illusions, Spiritus, which is his featured stage, is the exception because they really need to sell his kit. But really beyond that stage, I don't really think that you need weapon type in perils. It is interesting that his force attack hits all 3 weapon types, and while that may come in handy in some force weaknesses, Nowadays, a number of force weaknesses also require additional effects. For example, the 6 warrior quest also requires you to steal the enemy's buffs and cleanse your party debuffs as well. This brings me to the end of this pool plan video. In summary, I plan to throw tickets on Cor and Noctis, and very likely I will skip Edgar now that I think about it, but really I haven't even sunk my teeth on the mechanics behind the Shiva stage yet, so I don't want to say that I'll definitely skip, but I'm sort of leaning towards that direction anyway. Thanks a lot for watching, and as always, if you find this video helpful, do leave a like, comment and subscribe because it really helps a lot. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next pool plan video. Bye!